May Day Eve by Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 1. It was in the spring when I at last found time from the hospital work to visit my friend, the old folklorist, in his country isolation, and I rather chuckled to myself, because in my bag I was taking down a book that utterly refuted all his tiresome pet theories of magic and the powers of the soul. These theories were many and various, and had often troubled me. In the first place, I scorned them for professional reasons, and in the second, because I had never been able to argue quite well enough to convince or to shake his faith in even the smallest details, and any scientific knowledge I brought to bear only fed him with confirmatory data. To find such a book, therefore, and to know that it was safely in my bag, wrapped up in brown paper and addressed to him, was a deep and satisfactory joy, and I speculated a good deal during the journey how he would deal with the overwhelming arguments it contained against the existence of any important region outside the world of sensory perceptions. Speculative, too, I was whether his visionary habits and absorbing experiments would permit him to remember my arrival at all, and I was accordingly relieved to hear from the solitary porter that the professor had sent a vehicle to meet me, and that I was thus free to send my bag and walk the 4 miles to the house across the hills. It was a calm, windless evening just after sunset, the air warm and scented and delightfully still. The train, already sinking into distance, carried away with it the noise of crowds and cities and the last suggestions of the stressful life behind me. And from the little station on the moorland, I stepped at once into the world of silent, growing things, tinkling sheep bells, shepherds, and wild, desolate spaces. My path lay diagonally across the turfy hills. It slanted a mile or so to the summit, wandered vaguely another 2 miles among gorse bushes along the crest, past Tom Bassett's cottage by the pines, and then dropped sharply down on the other side, through rather thin woods, to the ancient house where the old folklorist lived and dreamed himself into his impossible world of theory and fantasy. I fell to thinking busily about him during the first part of the ascent, and convinced myself, as usual, that but for his generosity to the poor and his benign aspect, the peasantry must undoubtedly have regarded him as a wizard who speculated in souls and had dark dealings with the world of faerie. The path I knew tolerably well. I had already walked it once before, a winter's day some years ago, and from the cottage onward felt sure of my way. But for the first mile or so there were so many cross cattle tracks, and the light had become so dim, that I felt it wise to inquire more particularly. And this I was fortunately able to do of a man who, with astonishing suddenness, rose from the grass where he had been lying behind a clump of bushes, and passed a few yards in front of me at a high pace downhill toward the darkening valley. He was in such a state of hurry that I called out loudly to him, fearing to be too late. But on hearing my voice, he turned sharply, and seemed to arrive almost at once beside me. In a single instant he was standing there, quite close, looking with a smile and a certain expression of curiosity, I thought, into my face. I remember thinking that his features, pale and wholly untanned, were rather wonderful for a countryman, and that the eyes were those of a foreigner. His great swiftness, too, gave me a distinct sensation, something almost of a start, though I knew my vision was at fault at the best of times, and of course especially so in the deceptive twilight of the open hillside. Moreover, as the way often is with instructions, the words did not stay in my mind very clearly after he had uttered them, and the rapid, panther-like movements of the man, as he quickly vanished down the hill again, left me with little more than a sweeping gesture indicating the line I was to follow. No doubt his sudden rising from behind the gorse bush, his curious swiftness, and the way he peered into my face, and even touched me on the shoulder, all combined to distract my attention somewhat from the actual words he used. And the fact that I was traveling at a wrong angle, and should have come out a mile too far to the right, helped to complete my feeling that his gesture pointing the way was sufficient. On the crest of the ridge, panting a little with the unwonted exertion, I lay down to rest a moment on the grass beside a flaming yellow gorse bush. There was still a good hour before I should be looked for at the house. The grass was very soft, the peace and silence soothing. I lingered and lit a cigarette. And it was just then, I think, that my subconscious memory gave back the words, the actual words the man had spoken, and the heavy significance of the personal pronoun, as he had emphasized it in his odd foreign voice, touched me with a sense of vague amusement. "The safest way for you now," he had said, as though I was so obviously a townsman and might be in danger on the lonely hills after dark. And the quick way he had reached my side, and then slipped off again like a shadow down the steep slope, completed a definite little picture in my mind. Then other thoughts and memories rose up and formed a series of pictures, following each other in rapid succession, and forming a chain of reflections undirected by the will and without purpose or meaning. I fell, that is, into a pleasant reverie. Below me, and infinitely far away, it seemed, the valley lay silent under a veil of blue evening haze, the lower end losing itself among darkening hills, whose peaks rose here and there like giant plumes that would surely nod their great heads and call to one another once the final shadows were down. The village lay a misty patch in which lights already twinkled. A sound of rooks faintly cawing, of seagulls crying far up in the sky, and of dogs barking at a great distance, rose up out of the general murmur of evening voices. Odors of farm and field and open spaces stole to my nostrils, and everything contributed to the feeling that I lay on top of the world, nothing between me and the stars, and that all the huge free things of the earth, hills, valleys, woods, and sloping fields, lay breathing deeply about me. A few seagulls, in daytime hereabouts they fill the air, still circled and wheeled within range of sight, uttering from time to time sharp petulant cries, and far in the distance there was just visible a shadowy line that showed where the sea lay. Then, as I lay gazing dreamily into this still pool of shadows at my feet, something rose up, something sheet-like, vast, imponderable, off the whole surface of the mapped-out country, moved with incredible swiftness down the valley, and, in a single instant, climbed the hill where I lay and swept by me, yet without hurry, and, in a sense, without speed. Veils in this way rose one after another, filling the cups between the hills, shrouding alike fields, village, and hillside as they passed, and settled down somewhere into the gloom behind me over the ridge, or slipped off like vapor into the sky. Whether it was actually mist rising from the surface of the fast-cooling ground, or merely the earth giving up her heat to the night, I could not determine. The coming of the darkness is ever a series of mysteries. I only know that this indescribable vast stirring of the landscape seemed to me as though the earth were unfolding immense sable wings from her sides, and lifting them for silent, gigantic strokes, so that she might fly more swiftly from the sun into the night. The darkness, at any rate, did drop down over everything very soon afterward, and I rose up hastily to follow my pathway, realizing with a degree of wonder strangely new to me the magic of twilight, the blue open depths into the valley below, and the pale yellow heights of the watery sky above. I walked rapidly, a sense of chilliness about me, and soon lost sight of the valley altogether as I got upon the ridge proper of these lonely and desolate hills. It could not have been more than 15 minutes that I lay there in reverie, yet the weather, I at once noticed, had changed very abruptly, for mist was seething here and there about me, rising somewhere from smaller valleys in the hills beyond, and obscuring the path, while overhead there was plainly a sound of wind tearing past, far up, with a sound of high shouting. A moment before it had been the stillness of a warm spring night, Yet now everything had changed. Wet mist coated me, raindrops smartly stung my face, and a gusty wind, descending out of cool heights, began to strike and buffet me, so that I buttoned my coat and pressed my hat more firmly upon my head. The change was really this, and it came to me for the first time in my life with the power of a real conviction, that everything about me seemed to have become suddenly alive. It came oddly upon me, prosaic, matter-of-fact, materialistic doctor that I was, this realization that the world about me had somehow stirred into life. Oddly, I say, because nature to me has always been merely a more or less definite arrangement of measurement, weight, and color, and this new presentation of it was utterly foreign to my temperament. A valley to me was always a valley, a hill merely a hill, a field so many acres of flat surface, grass or plowed, drained well or drained ill, whereas now, with startling vividness, came the strange, haunting idea that, after all, they could be something more than valley, hill, and field, that what I had hitherto perceived by these names were only the veils of something that lay concealed within, something alive. In a word, that the poetic sense I had always rather sneered at in others, or explained away with some shallow psychological label, had apparently suddenly opened up in myself without any obvious cause. And the more I puzzled over it, the more I began to realize that its genesis dated from those few minutes of reverie lying under the gorse bush. Reverie, a thing I had never before in all my life indulged in. Or, now that I came to reflect more accurately, from my brief interview with that wild-eyed, swift-moving, shadowy man of whom I had first inquired the way. I recalled my singular fancy that veils were lifting off the surface of the hills and fields, and a tremor of excitement accompanied the memory. Such a thing had never before been possible to my practical intelligence, and it made me feel suspicious. Suspicious about myself. I stood still a moment. I looked about me into the gathering mist, above me to the vanishing stars, below me to the hidden valley, and then sent an urgent summons to my individuality, as I had always known it, to arrest and chase these undesirable fancies. But I called in vain. No answer came. Anxiously, hurriedly, confusedly, too, I searched for my normal self, but could not find it. And this failure to respond induced in me a sense of uneasiness that touched very nearly upon the borders of alarm. I pushed on faster and faster along the turfy track among the gorse bushes with a dread that I might lose the way altogether, and a sudden desire to reach home as soon as might be. Then, without warning, I emerged unexpectedly into clear air again, and the vapor swept past me in a rushing wall and rose into the sky. Anew, I saw the lights of the village behind me in the depths, here and there a line of smoke rising against the pale yellow sky, and stars overhead, peering down through thin, wispy clouds that stretched their wind signs across the night. After all, it had been nothing but a stray bit of sea fog driving up from the coast, for the other side of the hills, I remembered, dipped their chalk cliffs straight into the sea, and strange lost winds must often come a-wandering this way with the sharp changes of temperature about sunset. Nonetheless, it was disconcerting to know that mist and storm lay hiding within possible reach, and I walked on smartly for a sight of Tom Bassett's cottage and the lights of the manor house in the valley a short mile beyond. The clearing of the air, however, lasted but a very brief while, and vapor was soon rising about me as before, hiding the path and making bushes and stone walls look like running shadows. It came, driven apparently by little independent winds up the many side gullies, and it was very cold, touching my skin like a wet sheet. Curious great shapes, too, it assumed, as the wind worked to and fro through it. Forms of men and animals, grotesque giant outlines, ever shifting and running along the ground with silent feet, or leaping into the air with sharp cries as the gusts twisted them inwardly and lent them voice. More and more I pushed my pace, and more darkness and vapor obliterated the landscape. The going was not otherwise difficult, and here and there cowslips glimmered in patches of dancing yellow, while the springy turf made it easy to keep up speed. Yet in the gloom I frequently tripped and plunged into prickly gorse near the ground, so that from shin to knee was soon a tingle with sharp pain. Odd puffs and spits of rain stung my face, and the periods of utter stillness were always followed by little shouting gusts of wind, each time from a new direction. Troubled is perhaps too strong a word, but flustered I certainly was, and though I recognized that it was due to my being in an environment so remote from the town life I was accustomed to, I found it impossible to stifle altogether the feeling of malaise that had crept into my heart, and I looked about with increasing eagerness for the lighted windows of Bassett's cottage. More and more little pinpricks of distress and confusion accumulated, adding to my realization of being away from streets and shop windows and things I could classify and deal with. The mist, too, distorted as well as concealed, played tricks with sounds as well as with sights, and once or twice, when I stumbled upon some crouching sheep, they got up without the customary alarm and hurry of sheep, and moved off slowly into the darkness, but in such a singular way that I could almost have sworn they were not sheep at all, but human beings crawling on all fours, looking back and grimacing at me over their shoulders as they went. On these occasions, for there were more than one, I could never get close enough to feel their woolly wet backs, as I should have liked to do, and the sound of their tinkling bells came faintly through the mist, sometimes from one direction, sometimes from another, sometimes all round me as though a whole flock surrounded me, and I found it impossible to analyze or explain the idea I received that they were not sheep bells at all, but something quite different. But mist and darkness and a certain confusion of the senses caused by the excitement of an utterly strange environment can account for a great deal. I pushed on quickly. The conviction that I had strayed from the route grew, nevertheless, for occasionally there was a great commotion of seagulls about me, as though I had disturbed them in their sleeping places. The air filled with their plaintive cries, and I heard the rushing of multitudinous wings, sometimes very close to my head, but always invisible owing to the mist. And once, above the swishing of the wet wind through the gorse bushes, I was sure I caught the faint thunder of the sea and the distant crashing of waves rolling up some steep-throated gully in the cliffs. I went cautiously after this, and altered my course a little away from the direction of the sound. Yet, increasingly all the time, it came to me how the cries of the seabirds sounded like laughter, and how the everlasting wind blew and drove about me with a purpose, and how the low bushes persistently took the shape of stooping people, moving stealthily past me, and how the mist more and more resembled huge protean figures, escorting me across the desolate hills, silently with immense footsteps. For the inanimate world now touched my awakened poetic sense in a manner hitherto unguided, and became fraught with the pregnant messages of a dimly concealed life. I readily understood, for the first time, how easily a superstitious peasantry might people their world, and how even an educated mind might favor an atmosphere of legend. I stumbled along, looking anxiously for the lights of the cottage. Suddenly, as a shape of writhing mist whirled past, I received so direct a stroke of wind that it was palpably a blow in the face. Something swept by with a shrill cry into the darkness. It was impossible to prevent jumping to one side and raising an arm by way of protection, and I was only just quick enough to catch a glimpse of the seagull as it raced past, with sudden altered flight, beating its powerful wings over my head. Its white body looked enormous as the mist swallowed it. At the same moment, a gust tore my hat from my head and flung the flap of my coat across my eyes. But I was well trained by this time, and made a quick dash after the retreating black object, only to find, on overtaking it, that I held a prickly branch of gorse. The wind combed my hair viciously. Then, out of a corner of my eye, I saw my hat still rolling, and grabbed swiftly at it, but just as I closed on it, the real hat passed in front of me, turning over in the wind like a ball, and I instantly released my first capture to chase it. Before it was within reach, another one shot between my feet so that I stepped on it. The grass seemed covered with moving hats, yet each one, when I seized it, turned into a piece of wood, or a tiny gorse bush, or a black rabbit hole, till my hands were scored with prickles and running blood. In the darkness, I reflected, all objects looked alike, as though by general conspiracy. I straightened up and took a long breath, mopping the blood with my handkerchief. Then something tapped at my feet, and on looking down, there was the hat within easy reach, and I stooped down and put it on my head again. Of course, there were a dozen ways of explaining my confusion and stupidity, and I walked along wondering which to select. My eyesight, for one thing, under such conditions, why seek further? It was nothing, after all, and the dizziness was a momentary effect caused by the effort and stooping. But for all that, I shouted aloud, on the chance that a wandering shepherd might hear me. And of course, no answer came, for it was like calling in a padded room, and the mist suffocated my voice and killed its resonance. It was really very discouraging. I was cold and wet and hungry, my legs and clothes torn by the gorse, my hands scratched and bleeding. The wind brought water to my eyes by its constant buffeting, and my skin was numb from contact with the chill mist. Fortunately, I had matches, and after some difficulty, by crouching under a wall, I caught a swift glimpse of my watch, and saw that it was but little after 8 o'clock. Supper, I knew, was at 9, and I was surely over halfway by this time. But here again was another instance of the way everything seemed in a conspiracy against me to appear otherwise than ordinary. For in the gleam of the match, my watch-glass showed as the face of a little old grey man, uncommonly like the folklorist himself, peering up at me with an expression of whimsical laughter. My own reflection it could not possibly have been, for I am clean-shaven, and this face looked up at me through a running tangle of grey hair. Yet a second and third match revealed only the white surface with the thin black hands moving across it.